So our research actually looks at the role of relationship restoration. And one of the reasons that we actually started exploring this is that our particular group of co-authors, Misty, John, Zach, and myself, we have been looking at this uh, literature on buyer-supplier relationships. And for a very long time, we found that the literature was all about how do you build relationships. So it was mostly about what can you do to strengthen your relationships. And then recently, the literature started examining factors which actually lead to relationship dissolution. So I have one paper which has actually been published in JSCM, and then I have another paper with the same set of authors, which also looked at relationship dissolutions. So when we were thinking of extending the literature, it was natural that we decided what will make a supplier or a buyer come back to the relationship. Now, in this case, in our paper, we're actually looking at what makes a buyer come back to the relationships. And so the first thing that we thought was an apology, right? So if you think about breakups in general, fights in general, the first thing that happens is an apology is delivered. And so we started examining the apology literature in management. And that's how we started developing constructs and variables and ideas of what would be relevant. And that was pretty much the foundation of long ago of how we started this research idea. And then obviously along the way and through the review process, we adapted and we changed the paper a lot, because that's when we realized that the justice literature can be very useful as a theoretical lens that can be used for a manuscript. And so we actually now look at the role of justice in relationship restoration.
All right, so I like to start myself off with a guiding question. And the question that we settled upon for this research is, what restoration tactics can suppliers deploy that are effective in winning back estranged buyers? So we're looking at a competitive setting, and we start off with this idea that there was some transgression by the supplier. So the next question becomes, well, what restoration tactics should be deployed? So we essentially look at three. We look at acknowledgement, and you can think about that as the supplier simply acknowledging the mistake to the buyer. And then the next one that we look at is we look at compensation. And really what that focuses on is that the buyer is compensated by the supplier for a loss that's incurred. And then last but not least is our operational transparency. And you can think about that as the supplier putting up a path to move forward. So we look at those restoration tactics and say, do these indeed restore the relationship? Or what are the restoration intentions of the buyer after they receive these tactics? And as Saif mentioned, justice is very important to this literature. So we were looking at justice as causing a mediating effect. Acknowledgement ties to interactional fairness, and interactional fairness is composed of interpersonal and informational justice. And then compensation ties to distributive fairness as the mediator. And distributive fairness really has to look at, there's a pie that the party receives from the relationship. So how do you divide up the pieces of the pie? Is it equal? What do the pieces look like that are divided up between the recipients of the reward of the relationship? And then last but not least is procedural fairness. And procedural fairness essentially has to do with how something is implemented. So we look at all of those as mediators within this relationship. And the way that we went about doing this, putting this model together, is first we began with some interviews. So we talked to 10 purchasing managers, and we looked at 9 sales managers. And we started with this question: do suppliers seek to restore relationships? And we found that yes, they do. And then we talked about, how they would go about doing this to make sure that our tactics were consistent with what's truly going on in industry. That set us all up for this vignette-based experiment. We actually did a between subjects experiment. And in order to set this up, we talked to 4 practitioners and 3 academics, and we went through this iterative process with them. if you spend any time with experiments, or people that are familiar with experiments can probably imagine this looked like a 2x2x2 with 50 in each treatment group. So we ended up with a total of 390 practitioners. And we relied on a Qualtrics panel to do that. And we wanted practitioners because they would be experienced with what was going on in the industry. So essentially, we were looking at practitioners who had experience dealing with suppliers. And just to give you some key points before I ask Saif if I have it all, because I feel like there's a lot to this. The assignment was to make decisions as the purchasing manager of a flower distributor. And the participants were actually given the motive of get the best value and a reliable supply. And we were actually able to take out switching costs. And in the iterative process that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we had one of our practitioners commented that a purchasing manager would have multiple accounts with multiple vendors already. So we were able to, take that off the table as an issue. And then we introduced the transgression. And then we told the participant that you switched suppliers, and then they were presented with a manipulation. And I feel like there's something in there that I'm missing. So Steph, help me out if I missed anything in there.
No, that's about it. So because it was a competitive setting, we decided that switching costs wouldn't be an issue because like one of the practitioners mentioned, especially in commodity markets, it is very common for a buyer to have accounts with multiple suppliers. And so it is not uncommon for them to just switch very easily. And so in such situations, what can a buyer do or a supplier do to win back a relationship becomes the basic crust of our research. And we presented each participant with one of the three types of the tactics that they have for acknowledgement, compensation, and for operational transparency. And we compared them with the control group, which did not receive any of these, to actually gauge if they actually increase the participants' intention to return to the relationship. Like Misty has mentioned, our experimental study was looking at the role of acknowledgement, compensation, and transparency on relationship restoration. And then also it was looking at the mediation effects of how interactional justice, distributive justice, and procedural justice impact relationship restoration. So we actually found that in a competitive setting where there are no switching costs as such, acknowledgement as such has no role to play. In other words, suppliers didn't really care about receiving an acknowledgement of that. So in some ways it signaled that it is money talks, right? That is what is more important. But what was interesting is that while acknowledgement was not significant, international fairness does have a place in buyer-supplier relationships. And I think this goes back to the literature, which talks about how buyers and suppliers are trying to build on social exchange. So they want to feel that they are treated well and with dignity. So that is an important part to that. But then we found that compensation and transparency as such both have a positive effect on relationship restoration. And the effect of compensation was mediated by distributive justice, and transparency was mediated by procedural justice. And in some ways, this does go back to point to the importance of making sure that you are remedying your past mistakes. If you think about compensation, the fact that you are compensating someone is because you did a transgression which hurt your buyer or your supplier. So compensation is making up for that. And what operational transparency is basically doing is setting you up for the future. In other words, it is making sure that you are promising your partner that in future, if something like this ever happens, we have a fair set of policies that will look after you. So that gives you enough backup and belief in the relationship to re-enter that.
So, and again, I like to kind of set myself up with a guiding question. And one of the things that we found in here is that a supplier doesn't need to appeal to all three justice dimensions in unison to get the buyer to restore the relationship. So an interesting extension to our research would be one justice dimension violated, one repair tactic. So, how does that work? Does the justice dimension and the repair tactic match up? That to me is probably my favorite for moving forward, but there are a lot of different ways that this research could go. One example would be to look at a less competitive setting, because we are looking at a very competitive setting with a lot of suppliers. So how does this change if we move to a less competitive setting? And of course, beyond that, another way to look at this would be to, instead of having the supplier who committed the transgression, who is essentially trying to fix the wrong, would be, what if the buyer commits the transgression and the buyer wants to restore the relationship with the supplier? How would this type of research answer that question? Or, how would things look differently in that situation? Another one is to look at the cause of the disruption, so the intentionality. We're essentially looking at reneging versus a disruption. And a couple more ideas are to even look at timing, because we know that sometimes um, we're trying to repair a relationship very quickly is a good thing to do, but sometimes waiting a while to try to repair that relationship um, is also valued more than a quick apology, if you will. So timing of the relationship repair could be interesting. And then, of course, there's always channel power or interorganizational power. So those are some ways that this research could move beyond just looking at the restoration intentions.
So two of the things that we found significant was the role of compensation. And it is important for practitioners as such to realize compensation is not necessarily about money, right? You're not offering them a bulk sum as such. It can be anything by being more flexible, by giving them incentives of some way, by showing more willingness to invest in the relationship by giving them better deals in terms of lead times or some discounts, because more often than not a company cannot literally give them a money, because it's not so easy to show it on your financial books as such. And then also thinking back about operational transparency, while it does make sense to have fair policies, it is also important to think about how such policies will impact all your suppliers or all your customers, I'm sorry, because you can't have fair policy for one and unfair for the other, right? So you cannot appear biased, because the whole idea is that when you're providing it, you are unfair to everyone. And so that's also something that companies need to be aware of, that when you're thinking of policies as such, you have to make sure that you appear fair to your entire set of customers. And that's going to be really important.
Okay, so one other thing about this research is that when Saif and I were going through this with Zach and John, we were thinking about, we have these restoration tactics of acknowledgement, compensation, and operational transparency. And as we were going through this, it occurred to us that the restoration tactic of acknowledgement is actually focused at the present situation. But when we look at compensation, it actually looks back to what happened in the past and how do we reverse that wrong of the past. And then operational transparency is an assurance for the future. So when we think about those restoration tactics, we have the now, the past, and then the future incorporated into those restoration tactics.